Hi, friends of the Dismantled Church. I'm Conrad Kanegi, and I've been sharing this week with a number of essays, reflections this week and last as I've been with students and been thinking about how what I'm doing in the classroom is reflected in their lives and in the church. I've told them this morning, and I've told them repeatedly this semester, that it is the richest time to be a sociologist in the world these days that I've ever experienced, because it's like the ground has broken open. It's as if you were an archaeologist and suddenly someone had excavated this field that was rich with artifacts. And that's really what it is for us as sociologists. The taken for granted reality that we knew is broken, and we get the opportunity to see into those things that we took for granted before. And so I wrote this little essay coming out of class yesterday after my anthropology class, and I thought I'd share it. It's on a podcast, the Church Dismantled podcast. It's also on the blog at the website www.churchdismantled.com. But I begin by saying that I was with these students. I'm on Zoom right now with 35 students, 36 students in the classroom, and they're all looking at me bright and energetic and very engaged. As I've said last week, they've taken command of Zoom. They're using it well. They're interacting with one another. They're interacting with me. It's not quite the three dimension of the classroom, but it's a pretty good approximate. And we were talking about culture shock and how culture shock occurs when we step out of the cultural map we're in and we go into a new one, and how COVID has created a new cultural map for us. It's taken the map we had and it's just destroyed it. And we feel in shock. We feel in terror. I described a situation when I was in Ecuador as a 18-year-old and was living with a Quechua family in the highlands of Chimborazo province. And I was sure they were going to force me to marry their daughter Marta, and I'd never get home to Big Valley. Of course, that didn't happen, but the terror I felt happened, because the terror we feel when the culture shifts or when we change culture is real. Peter Berger's a sociologist who described what he called anomie. Anomie being this experience where we no longer know the norms, no longer feel like we know the rules of the culture around us, which is clearly what has happened in this time of COVID. We have lost track of the culture, the guardrails have come off, as it were, and the culture has shifted. And so what many of us feel is terror. What intrigues me is that when I see my students, they seem to be reacting and responding to this culture shift, this culture change, with a lot more nimbleness and fluidity than I really see in the church. And what dawned on me this week is just the fact that what I wrote in 2007 about the church, which was true then and even truer now, is that the church is old. Our children are fleeing us. The average age of the church members is going up. And we are aging, and it is simply more difficult for those who are aging or older to adjust to a cultural map that changes. And so I think part of the frozen feeling I get from the church these days is the difficulty the church, often an older church, has with changing its orientation in the midst of a cultural map. But my kids in class are their cultural map hasn't yet solidified. It hasn't frozen in place, and so they're able to shift and to change with all of these changes that we're experiencing in the culture. I think of the story of Hezekiah. Hezekiah was king, and God said to him through the prophet, "You're going to die, but after you die, Nebuchadnezzar is going to come from Babylon and take you into exile." And his words were something like this: "As long as it doesn't happen in my lifetime." And what was going on for Hezekiah is that not so much that he cared whether the temple was destroyed or not, as long as the cultural map that he knew that gave him comfort didn't change. And I think that's the temptation for all of us. We didn't ever want to face a COVID. We thought we could get through history as a church without an exile, without a COVID experience, without this kind of liminality. But here we are. And it's hard for us to shift and to change bearings in that way. And so we stand, as Berger said, at the edge of a cliff almost, at the edge of an abyss, terrified by what lies ahead. I think, too, of why God asked his people not to go into the promised land after the 10 spies came back and said, we can't conquer Canaan. He asked them not to go into the promised land for 40 years, I think, because they had an old cultural map. They had an old cultural map where it was being carried by those who were older, and those who were older had to die before they could move into a land that needed a new map. And so part of the challenge for the church is, who are the carriers of the new map? Who are the carriers that are going to carry the church into a post-COVID time And are we thinking about that? Are we asking who those carriers are? I think about the young people that I see in my class, and I think about how many of them I know are not churched and have been turned off from the church as a whole. And yet I also know that I talk to them freely about Jesus, about the kingdom, about the gospel, and that makes sense to them. It resonates with them. And in some ways these days, I simply feel more comfortable in that kind of cultural map than I do the old cultural map that so often the church is identified with. And so I offer this as a critique of myself as a leader, critique of the church I'm in, but a critique that I think we need to be thinking about if we're going to move successfully into what my students clearly know as a post-COVID world that's going to be different than the pre-COVID world. When I was a grad student at Penn State, I worked with Glenn Firebaugh, who was a sociologist and also an evangelical, but he developed a statistical program for mapping change. And what he ended up saying was that the greatest change comes when we who are old die, because we who are old take our cultural maps with us. And so can we who are older, and I put myself in that category, or we who are old, adjust to this time and absorb a new cultural map, or do we need to get out of the way to let those who have a different map, who understand the kingdom differently, who understand Jesus differently, who understand the gospel differently, move into that space? I don't know. I just know that I'm blessed to be with 18 to 21-year-olds all of the time, and I'm blessed by the energy, the advocacy, and the way that they're seeing so clearly in this time of COVID and this time of change, and the way they're adapting. And I pray that for the church as well. Thanks for being with me today, and you can go to the website at www.dismantledchurch.com or the podcast where this is also found at Church Dismantled, A Kingdom Restored. Thanks. Hope you have a good day. Thanks for being part of this and part of this community of a Church Dismantled.